Thanks, John. I appreciate, again, the opportunity. And what he said is absolutely true. Understanding something about where we came from, I think, will give you a better sense of what we are now and what we could be if people just had a mind to do the right thing. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off on Thursday when we were talking about the formation of the SBC. I'm not going to rag on the SBC. If it wasn't for the SBC, there wouldn't be us, really, if you stop and think about it. The Southern Baptist Convention was formed primarily out of a larger national. This thing is going to start rumbling on me again, isn't it? I'm cursed. No doubt about it. Last week I got scammed by a fake drummer. You knew that, didn't you? Yeah, everybody in here knew that except me until after. It was you, wasn't it?
No, that's not me.
No. You're not going to do it to me again. Fool me once. Yeah, you know how that goes then. Anyway, Baptists were pretty much nationally unified up through about the 1840s, and then in the 1850s things started kind of falling apart. Politically, primarily, it was external stuff. And it had to do with agrarian versus industrialization, it had to do with slavery versus non-slavery, lots of other things. And sometimes the tensions were just so great that people could not continue to be together. And then, of course, when the union itself split, then it even became even more inevitable. But what arose from that was this very, very large, very powerful Southern Baptist Convention that, again, started off mainly as just a convention. It was not an organization that was just there all the time, handing out edicts and structuring things for everybody. There was an annual convention. They elected a moderator every year, and at the end of the week, that moderator's job was over. They didn't go to an office somewhere and start handing out orders. Churches would send messengers to talk about the things that were going on in the churches, and of course all the other organizations. The real structure was to be found in the local associations, and that in many cases is in many ways is the case even today. But over time, the convention became much more organized, and by the time that we get to the end of World War I, then it had begun to form some of the bureaucratic structures within it that then led to some problems, and eventually led to the rise of the Independent Baptists. In the early 1900s, J. Frank Norris becomes a bright, shining star for the Southern Baptists. And he's an important figure in our history. Our next slide here, I think, will kind of give you an idea of the sort of things that he's going to be involved in. He actually sort of strikes against the bureaucracy and becomes somewhat of an anti-denominationalist. And he argues that the power is being distributed in a wrong way. And in fact, in the 20s and 30s, as Baylor was picking up some steam there in Texas, the convention wanted everybody to raise a whole lot of money, but instead of simply saying, "Can you help us out here?" they would send invoices to individual churches and say, "This is your share." Well, you can imagine how that would go over today, much less back then. He became an outspoken critic of modernism on the campus of Baylor, and eventually became such an object of contempt by the Southern Baptists that he was actually ousted from the Tarrant County Association. This is an important point to remember. J. Frank Norris considered himself a Southern Baptist to his death in 1952. And he never really left it so much as he was actually sort of pushed out. Let's get a picture of what this guy was like here. It's hard to imagine, I think, from a photograph like this to understand just what sort of a powerhouse we're talking about here. Norris was that bright shining star. He was that guy that so many women among the Baptists wanted their sons to grow up to be. He was fiery. He had oratory. He had great passion, And because of his ability to speak and to sway crowds and so on, it made him quite an independent figure and also a dangerous figure from the standpoint of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so they pulled him out, and knowing then that the Baptists still needed some sort of a structure, some sort of an organization in order to kind of hold everybody together and keep them on the right track. He, along with some other independent Baptists, some leaders from the north, a couple of others from the northeast, and then a couple of others even from the south, and they formed what was called the Baptist Bible Union. And the Baptist Bible Union, you can see there, it really kind of was in existence for 2 years, 1922 to 1923. And the reason for that is, I mean, they were against so many of the bad things that were going on in what they considered to be these denominational structures, both in the South as well as in the North. And they wanted to kind of step out from that. They had a lot of doctrinal issues. These weren't guys that were just nitpicking on things. They had people in seminaries and people in denominational structures that were denying basic doctrines of the faith. And so they put together, one of the great things that the Baptist Bible Union did was they put together a confession of faith made up of 18 articles. And those 18 articles stand almost verbatim in the articles of the Baptist Bible Fellowship even today, as well as the World Baptist Fellowship. But one of our founders, Bill Dowd, before he passed away, said the great problem with the Baptist Bible Union was that it failed because there was no affirmative vision. In other words, they all knew what they were against, but hardly anybody knew what they were for. And so it just sort of dissolved. And this, of course, is the nature of most protest movements. You've got to have something for everybody to kind of unite on. You can't just say we're against everybody else and hope to hold together a group like that. It doesn't work that way at all. And so Mr. Norris, along with his friends in the South, began to come together on a regular basis, and they formed what was called the Premillennial Missionary Baptist Fellowship. They had just kind of gotten a hold in of premillennialism, and that became a big thing for them. They began teaching in prophecy conferences, and Mr. Norris would organize these semi-annual Bible conferences in Fort Worth, and preachers from all over the South would come to Fort Worth, and they would be inspired, they would be educated, they would go home and want to build churches and start churches and become evangelistic in their hometowns. And it was in the middle of one of these premillennial conferences that they had a prayer meeting. And in that prayer meeting, something came up. Somebody came up with something about missions. They said, you know, it's a shame that whenever we send money away to a mission sending agency, a mission board or something like that, only a small fraction of that seems like it actually gets onto the field. Everybody else has kind of taken their share in it, and the structures and so on are taking that. And somebody said, how's this for an idea? What if we started a missionary outreach where when a church gives $1 to the board sends the whole dollar to the missionary? What a neat idea, huh? You know, we've been doing that in the Baptist Bible Fellowship since our founding in 1950. But there was a time when that was a brand new idea. In fact, several other ideas that we now take for granted, like the idea that churches themselves ought to be the senders of missionaries, not mission boards, that's something that came up among the independent Baptists. The denominational Baptists didn't think that up. The independent Baptists thought that up. So many of the things that we do take for granted. And so this group in the South, this premillennial conference, that was just made up, it's kind of just loosely organized, and there were really no denominational offices or any structure or anything for it. Although they realized that if we're going to have a group with any sort of long-lasting impact, we're going to have some sort of an education institution. And so Mr. Norris started the Bible Baptist Seminary, and it was housed there in the facilities of First Baptist Church in Fort Worth. And after a while, this particular fellowship began to sort of mature, and as it matured, it took on a new name. In fact, it took on this idea of missionary sending as a basic idea in its name, the World Fundamental Baptist Missionary Fellowship, or the World Baptist Fellowship for short. And this assumes some of those functions we used to talk about last week on associations, mutual cooperation, doctrinal unity, mutual encouragement, exchanging of pastors and preachers, and engaging together to operate a Bible college or to plant churches. Again, all the same things that we saw back in the Bible, back in the book of Acts in our study last Thursday, and then of course the things that we saw in England and then later on in New England as they brought some of these ideas on over. So these groups, these early groups then, including the Baptist Bible Union, even though it was a fairly short-lived institution, was there to have mutual benefits so that the churches and the preachers and the people involved would be able to raise the money for the missionaries, raise the money for the seminary. And the way you got in was fairly simple. That is, you just started attending. You just sort of came and you volunteered and you gave money to the projects. And it was strictly a voluntary kind of a thing. You weren't going to get any invoices. Mr. Norris, we already knew what he thought about that sort of a thing. And then, of course, as Mr. Norris became older, then other leaders began to emerge in other parts of the country. Some of the people that we now have gracing our hallways and the pictures and the names that you see on the buildings around here are the names of those leaders then that began to emerge in about the center of the 20th century. Now, this was kind of rocking on pretty good up until about 1950. And in the years between 1945 and 1950, these new leaders coming up and the idea that we're not going to centralize an awful lot of authority and power in one place or in one church or in one person began to lead to some power struggles. And just like we have seen in biblical examples and the way we've seen in many church historical examples, people will tell you sometimes that whole 1950 thing, that was just all a bunch of personality. One guy couldn't get along with another. It was much, much more than that. They were engaged in a discussion on how do you distribute power. You know, it's a real problem among us because we're not really big on bureaucracy. We're really not big on top-down organization as Baptists. Baptists are by nature sort of independent-minded. You know, did you ever try to baptize a cat? That does not go well, okay? Cats are already Baptist, and that's the reason why it doesn't go very, very well. And so when you try to get people who are independent-minded all going the same way, telling them to do it and saying it's an order is the surest, quickest way for them not to do it. That's just the way it is. So you have to influence, and you have to talk, and you have to cooperate, and you have to kind of draw people to things. And so there's not a whole lot of power, really, in an organization like the Baptist Bible Fellowship to be had. But sometimes it's where you don't have much power, where the struggle for power is the greatest. And that's ironic to me. One of the issues that came up in 1950 was, are we going to have a sort of a democratic kind of a form of government? In other words, is one pastor going to have as much voice as another pastor? Or are we just going to let one group or one man make all the decisions for everybody else? Nobody thought that the organization itself was an issue. It wasn't that just organizing and coming together as an association is a bad thing, but rather when you start concentrating power and authority within the hands of one or a few, then you are going to have problems. And so it becomes a centralization issue then. So among these leaders in 1950, when eventually things in 1950, and I'm not going to go into all the details, it would be really easy here for me to get into the flesh and talk about those something like the gunfight at the OK Corral or something like that. Honestly, there were no guns that I'm aware of that actually showed themselves as a split. But there was a lot of hollering, and there was a lot of conflict, and there was a lot of fighting, and you can see evidences of that. If you want to get a little more detail on the actual event itself that caused the split, then on the Tribune website, you can download the first issue of the Baptist Bible Tribune that was printed in 1950, June 23rd. And you can read in those 8 pages there pretty much what happened there in 1950 to cause the split. But the important thing I want you to understand is that the split took place, and the men whose names I'm about to read to you are the ones that became the central figures. And notice that there's no just one of them, rather there were several of them that were involved in leadership of this new movement. One of them was Mr. Vick. Mr. Vick had operated primarily out of Detroit. Before that, he was actually in Fort Worth working with Mr. Norris. But in the 1930s and early 40s, he was transferred by Mr. Norris to go to Detroit because at the time, J. Frank Norris was the pastor of a church in Fort Worth and in Detroit. Kind of unheard of. But that was the case, and he left Mr. Vick pretty much in charge, and he was considered to be the administrator or the general superintendent of the church. But as time goes on, of course, the people's loyalty began to turn towards Mr. Vick. And so when later on, when the split occurred and a vote had to be taken in the church, are we going to have Mr. Vick be our pastor, or are we going to have Mr. Norris remain pastor? Then Mr. Vick was retained there as the pastor. He was also the first president of Baptist Bible College, a position that he held for the next 25 years. This was his great passion. You know, Mr. Vick was never ordained into the ministry. Never was. Never was. He actually did not think that he was ever actually going to become a pastor. It was almost accidental. But he was the president of the Baptist Bible College for about 25 years. His legacy was carried on in many ways here at Baptist Bible College by Mr. W. Dowd, whose name is on the field house now. You've seen this picture, I'm sure. Mr. Dowd became the first president of the Baptist Bible Fellowship when it was founded in 1950. He had been the president of the World Baptist Fellowship the year before when actually the split took place, and so it just seemed natural to the men who put together this new movement, about 120 of them who actually broke out, said that we would like you to become our first president. He was the pastor of High Street Baptist Church at the time. And there had been plans on the table to build a college somewhere in the Midwest that would be like the Bible Baptist Seminary, and Springfield seemed like a pretty good place for that to happen. And that's the reason why we're sitting where we are today and the meeting where we are. Another man whose name you need to become familiar with is Fred Donaldson. Mr. Donaldson was able to speak from the high ground in so many ways. He had been a missionary in China. He had left China twice, both times basically at the point of a gun. The first time that he had to leave China was because of World War II. And he had been taken captive and actually lived in not quite a prisoner of war camp because he was not a soldier, but he was kept in detention by the Japanese for quite a long time until he was released near the end of the war. And then when he went back to China, he had to flee at the time of the Communist Revolution there. And so when he came back to the States then in 1948, he became kind of an instant leader in missions, and he was one of the great founders of our fellowship. And so he was chosen almost unanimously to be in charge of whatever missionary activity this new group might have. You know, there were only about 7 or 8 missionaries basically that we started off with. By 1960, that number had swelled considerably, just like Baptist Bible College had swelled. Here's a fellow here that this next one is very dear to me. This is Mr. Noel Smith. He stood up in that organizational meeting in Fort Worth, and he said, let's have a paper, and let's call it the Baptist Bible Tribune. I have a job today because of Mr. Noel Smith. Actually, I'm grateful to him. But more than that, he left me a legacy. He left me some guiding light. Nearly everything that we do at the Baptist Bible Tribune today is filtered in some way and touched in some way by Mr. Noel Smith. He was a great man, a great leader, and a great thinker. And at the time of the founding of the Baptist Bible Fellowship was probably the most intelligent man we had in our midst. And we've tried to keep that tradition going at the Baptist Bible Tribune. I'm only kidding. Remember, I got scanned by the fake drummer, okay? Yeah. Another man whose name became very familiar to everybody and until just recently was still quite familiar to most of us, Mr. John Rawlings. John Rawlings had been the pastor of the Central Baptist Church in Tyler. and had been there since the 40s, and shortly after the formation of the Baptist Bible Fellowship, made his home in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he led the Landmark Baptist Church there for many years. And of course, he passed away just this past year. But he's also a man who had a great influence on this movement in many ways. He was a great spokesman, great promoter. He would speak in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of youth camps during the summer months, and would speak in revival meetings and tent meetings, anywhere where he could get himself up on a platform and talk about the benefits and the advantages of being a part of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. And he did that for several years. Now, over the next 10 years, from 1950 to 1960, most of the work of the Baptist Bible Fellowship was concentrated on Baptist Bible College. Everybody agreed that if we're going to have any kind of a movement, we are going to have to educate and train people in order to work in our churches. Missionary growth led to the formation of policies and a separate mission office. Our first mission office was actually the corner of a desk over at High Street Baptist Church, where Mrs. Alotta Sage was the church secretary. But it eventually became the powerhouse that you see across the street here, servicing missionaries all across the world, processing millions and millions of dollars going into the mission field. Smith carried on a lively debate with Norris over the next year about you're right, I'm right, you're wrong, that sort of thing. And in the 1950s became a time of growth and consolidation. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, we see churches coming up. Some of the largest churches in America were Baptist Bible Fellowship churches, people trained at Baptist Bible College over the years. One of the things I like to do when we get to this point in the history is to talk about what it was that caused our fellowship to be such a powerhouse from 1950 to 1975. I think there are three founding principles. These are the three things I want you to take from these two sessions, if nothing else. Our fellowship was founded on these three philosophies. You won't find them listed anywhere except it's something I have written. I had to inductively arrive at these things, but they're all over the place if you start looking around for them. One of them was the democratic ideal. In the Baptist Bible Fellowship, no one person or one small group of people speaks for everybody else. Every pastor, every person who is involving themselves in the Baptist Bible Fellowship has a way to get heard in some way. You may not always get your way, but you can always get a hearing. A democratic ideal. Noel Smith talks about this a very great deal in the early days of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. Positive thrust. We were not going to recreate the mistake made with the Baptist Bible Union. We're not going to simply be just against those guys. We're going to be for something. One of the things that was said in the organizational meeting, Mr. Donaldson said this. He said, I feel like that I've taken off an old suit and I put on a new suit, and I hope that the right arm of this new suit will be missions. And if nothing else survives in the Baptist Bible Fellowship 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what will survive is this idea of the mission. It will survive no matter what, because that is really what Baptist Bible Fellowship was all about, and that was worldwide evangelism, both across the world, across the sea, as well as here. It's just one of the things that we do. We build churches, we plant churches. The third thing here, and this is a very important thing I think for you to remember as well, what I call a leanness in organization. You know, there really aren't all that many rules in the Baptist Bible Fellowship. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who think there are more rules than there really are, but you can't let those people fool you. We live by the 20 Articles of Faith. Learn the 20 Articles of Faith, learn what this fellowship teaches, and you'll be a long ways towards trying to figure out where your place is in this fellowship. Now, I don't necessarily think that you need to go out and memorize the bylaws so much, although that would be a handy thing to do, because I find myself educating pastors every day about the bylaws, even sometimes our elected officers. And knowing those bylaws and knowing what is and is not reality goes a long ways toward trying to figure out where you fit in this fellowship. But more than that is the 20 Articles of Faith. Did you ever notice the 20 Articles of Faith? are somewhat general, and in some cases they're just downright vague. And that is for a reason. That was in order to be inclusive in the numbers of churches and the numbers of pastors and people that we could bring into the movement. For instance, there are some things there about baptism that have to do with, well, you need water and you need to have a baptizing authority, but there are some other things that are sort of left unsaid about baptism, and that is to allow some room of variation among churches. Same thing with the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is described in fairly vague terms, but we have differences of opinion about the Lord's Supper throughout our fellowship. When it should be observed, how often it should be observed, who is to be there at the meeting whenever it takes place, and you can have a variety of opinions on these issues in the Baptist Bible Fellowship and still be a part of the group. That's what I mean by a leanness of organization. Now, what happens is, often in our fellowship, is these principles become violated. They violate these principles. And we saw it happen in 1959. I wish I had another 30 minutes up here today to talk to you about what happened in 1959 and 1960, because that probably more than anything else defines who we are as a fellowship. But basically, it amounted to this. One group of people wanted to make up rules that would apply to churches, and it would basically take my ideas and impose them upon you. And our fellowship very wisely, after a period of study, said, no, we're not going to do business that way. And in fact, at the end of that one-year study, and in that study they asked about what is it about our fellowship, what is it that we do, what is it that we're all about, what's important, and so on. They said these are the things that we do right here, these three things. We send missionaries / plant churches. We train Christian workers. That's what we're doing here at Baptist Bible College. And we meet regularly to foster and encourage the first two things. Missionaries, planting churches, training people to be missionaries and to plant those churches. And we meet regularly in order, and sometimes I think we meet too often if you want to know the truth of it, but we meet regularly to foster and encourage those two things. And what happened was, at the end of this year-long study, they determined that these are the things that we do, and we don't do anything else. In other words, we don't go around imposing an awful lot of extraneous rules on people. Now, it's pretty easy to get the idea when you're in Baptist Bible College that Baptist Bible Fellowship is all about living a certain way, dressing a certain way, preaching a certain way, playing your music in a certain way, and so on like that. It's not those things at all. Remember, leanness of organization. Now, there are some basics. We're not going to go beyond the 20 articles of faith, but we're also not going to be anxious to add a lot of stuff to those articles of faith either at the same time. In other words, if you look at Baptist Bible Fellowship like it's some sort of denominational structure, and you're finding yourself at this point saying, do I want to be a part of this group or do I not want to be a part of this group? If you believe somehow or another that by being a part of this group you're going to have strictures placed upon you that will keep you from fulfilling God's call, I'm here to tell you that is not the case with Baptist Bible Fellowship. You can be a part of Baptist Bible Fellowship if you're willing to engage in these three activities right here. Do you want to be a missionary? Do you want to plant churches? Do you want to be involved in training of people to work in these local churches? And do you want to meet with other Christian people to talk about these sorts of things? If you do, the Baptist Bible Fellowship is for you. And you don't really want to miss it. Now, one of the things that happened as a result of the 1960 meeting was we narrowly avoided becoming a rules-based convention or a denomination with a lot of structure in it. But instead, look at this next slide here, Noel Smith was able to say, let's look at that a little closer on the next slide there. We will remain a fellowship. That's what he said. We're not going to be like the other guys. Oh yeah, there's a little bit of protest in there, but we will remain a fellowship. And look at that subheadline there. Oklahoma City meeting sustains sovereignty of the local congregation. There's no other organization of Baptists anywhere in the world that values local church sovereignty any more than the Baptist Bible Fellowship. Now, that does not protect you from negativity. That does not protect you from criticism. You may go to a meeting and somebody may just lower the boom on you for whatever like that, but they're doing it from their own perspective and not from the perspective of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. And that's what you need to remember about this group. I hope perhaps maybe some other time I can come back over here and give you some more details about this whole 1959-1960 thing, and then also talk to you a little bit more about about how these principles have been violated in years past and how we have tried to recover from some of those violations. But let me tell you what, the attitude I had, I mentioned this last Thursday, that I did not want to be a part of this group, that I wanted to sort of just be my own guy, and I wanted to be the Lone Ranger kind of a Baptist pastor out there. It took me about 2 years before I finally figured out that basically I had turned my back on a family. I turned my back on good stuff that could have been done for me and with me. And over a period of time, I began to see the value of the Baptist Bible Fellowship. And I went back and I studied these things for myself. And I've been anxious to share them with as many people as I possibly can. It's been a real pleasure. You've been very, very respectful to me as a speaker. I appreciate so much the opportunity to come here and talk to you. I love the Baptist Bible Fellowship, and not just because that's the name up there on the left-hand side of my paycheck. It's my family. It's my family in many, many ways. And the experiences I had here at Baptist Bible College and the ones after in the local churches and among the missionaries and my association day by day with the Baptist Bible Fellowship keeps telling me it is something that is good to be a part of, and I would encourage you to do all you can to learn more about it and become a part of us in the future. I look forward to partnering with you in that endeavor. Thank you very much.